Could you speak to us a little bit about how you think teachers should be learning in their own practice?
So teachers have a huge impact, but all the research on them finds that on the average what happens is that they learn quite quickly in their first 3 years of teaching, because they're always out of their comfort zone and scaring themselves to death. And so they learn really quickly in the first year, extremely quickly. Second year, pretty quickly. Third year, fairly quickly. Fourth year, by then they've worked out things that work, and they think, hey, I did that lesson the other day. There was no blood on the walls. The students seem to learn something. I'll do the same next year. And my view is, why not try something that's worked exceptionally well in other people's classrooms? Because, there's a good bet it might work in yours too. Might not, but it might. And so try it in a small way first, 5 minutes of your lesson, so that even if it's a complete catastrophe, you've lost 5 minutes. That's no more. And we need to keep trying with this method, but the research on teacher improvement is fascinating. And there's a woman called Helen Timperley, who's written New Zealander, who's written for the New Zealand government, summarising all the research on teacher education and improvement. And she finds that it never happens unless teachers trial these methods, or approaches, techniques, whatever, and talk about them with their colleagues in what we call communities of practice, or peer coaching groups, or teacher learning communities. There's all sorts of different terminology. But if there's no opportunity for people to keep talking about their attempts to improve, and there's no encouragement for them to keep trialing the methods repeatedly, because you won't get it right first time necessarily, almost certainly. So this process of trying it out, talking about it, trying it out, talking about it, trying it out, talking about it, over very extended periods of time has been found to be the only way that you'll improve teaching. And that nearly all teachers don't do this because the institutions don't set themselves up to do it, encourage them and support them and give them the time, the meeting time and so on to do it. So most teachers are peaking at about 3 years, and they don't tend to change very much. They don't get very much better. Some teachers are exceptional in that they will experiment for themselves, by themselves. So there's no expectation that they trial things, but they just say, oh, I'm bloody going to do it. I think this is really interesting. We'll try this out. And so they get themselves out of their comfort zones, and they'll trial and improve. But they're perhaps 1 in 20 or something. They're not a lot of people will do that. But if we set up processes, that enable people to get out of their comfort zone and to try things out, well, guess what? They improve, and you can get massive improvements in an institution's performance. Helen Timperley has shown by looking at other people's research. Helen Timperley's research review shows that if you get this experimentation and talking about it, I call them supported experiments. If you get this going, huge impact on the students' learning, and of course on the teachers' teaching.
We've got a group of people on the certificate who really want to reflect on their own teaching development. So yeah. I was quite interested in yours, really, and how you changed as a teacher through your career.
Right, okay. What crystallised a good answer to that question, I recognised my own development in it, was a piece of work actually by a brilliant Australian educationalist, John Biggs. He said that teachers go, hopefully, through 3 phases. Some actually stick at the first, but the first phase, and I definitely went through this, was what am I going to do? And I would plan meticulously and produce materials and activities and so on. But my focus when I first started teaching, and I suppose it's natural really, is what am I going to say? What am I going to do? And then I became obsessed with, what activities should I set? And I was quite certain that I'd reached the pinnacle now. This was the question. How am I going to amuse, entertain, engage, and excite my students? And my student column got fuller and fuller, and my teacher column got less and less full. And then I noticed that some of the activities that I was setting students, I began to feel uneasy about them. They enjoyed them. And would often even comment on them on the way out of the classroom. And that was great fun. I really enjoyed that, you know. But then I began to think, hang on, though. What did they actually learn with that activity? You know, I mean, okay, it was about Newton's first law, but was it actually getting them to understand it? And I began to realise that I'd go through lessons on Newton's first law, set all these student activities, and then at the end, a month later, I'd give them a little test or something, and they knew sod all about it, it seemed to me. I mean, physics is notoriously difficult from the conceptual point of view, and it's very easy for students to think they understand things when they don't, and it's even easier for teachers to think they understand things when they don't. But so I became more and more interested then in this question, and I'm still interested in this question. I hope it's the last phase. John Biggs thought it might be, but I've got a horrible feeling that at the age of 80, a little light will come on and I'll realise I've been trying to do the wrong thing all my career. But now I'm interested in the activity I set. What does it make the students think about? I mean, it's such an obvious and simple question, really. But it's one thing to set an activity, but it's quite another to set an activity that makes students think with and about the key concepts and ideas and principles that you're trying to get across in that lesson. And if they don't think about it, they're not going to learn it, really. So that in a way, that was my sort of focus. First of all, me, what do I do? Secondly, students, how am I going to entertain them? Thirdly, what are these students thinking about? Are they going to be learning the principles and ideas and content and skills that I want them to learn by being forced to think about them during the activities I set?
You've got this lovely phrase in evidence-based teaching about the move from custom and practice to evidence-based practice. You use that analogy, and then you move to speaking about teachers as though they were medics and saying, well, why don't we look at theory all of the time and use it to refine what we're doing? Can you talk to us a little bit about the relevance of evidence and theory for day-to-day practice?
Well, I mean, when the researchers, and it was only sort of 20 years ago or so that it began, that a movement began to do research which measured the improvement in students' learning if a certain factor, strategy, technique, method, whatever, was in place compared to when it wasn't in place, wasn't being used. So, for example, if you get students to create a mind map of something that they've just studied and, express their understanding on paper in that way, and ideally then sort of having finished it or nearly finished it, get up and have a look at everybody else's mind map in the class, and then think, oh, fine, I didn't think of that. I'll go back and fix mine now. And then ideally the teacher shows key points that ought to be on the mind map on a screen, and the student looks at the key points to make sure that they are on the screen. That process, magically, the students will learn about 2 grades better. If you imagine grading work A, B, C, D, E, as often done in the UK, it improves their performance by 2 grades. So a student in a control group that didn't do the mind mapping and was taught otherwise identically would get a C grade, say. But if the same student were in the experimental group and they were doing the mind map, they would get an A grade. Now that's a big difference. It's sort of some of the methods that we know about that work really well will double the rate at which students learn. Double the rate. I mean, that seems to me to be quite extraordinary. And although, there are only some methods that have that power, we know which ones they are. And it just seems absolutely bonkers that we're not making use of those very much more vigorously. And it's staggering to me that initial teacher training doesn't still require this, although that might change in the UK in the next year or 4. But at the moment, there's no requirement that people look at this vast body of evidence, rather wonderfully summarised by an Australian academic, working in Australia now anyway, Professor John Hattie, and others, Professor Robert Marzano in the States and so on. So we know this stuff. It has a big impact. The methods are easy to use. The students love them. I mean, when I say easy to use, okay, it'll take you a year or two to get really good at them, but it takes you a year or two to get really good at any teaching method. And if anything, these methods are easier to use for the teacher once they've got them used working, because they put the student in the driving seat. Going back to my question before, what is the student thinking about when I set this activity? Well, they're thinking about all the aspects of this topic and how they're related to each other. So that's absolutely perfect. And they're also thinking about what have I missed out? They're going around looking at each other's, so the method makes the students think about the topic, think about what they've missed out, think about what they understand, express that understanding. Perfect.
As you have said, theories compete and theories come and go in education. Is this a way for you of sidestepping some of those fashions and theories a little bit? Or you mentioned John Biggs or Hattie, for example. Are there particular educational theories that you do adhere to?
I've always been a physical scientist in my background, and I've always looked very, very carefully at the philosophy of science and why it is that science is true, or as true as it is, and how it works in order to get there. So I've always read people like Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn and people like that ever since I was a teenager, because I'm just fascinated by it. And so I've just tried to, I can't stop myself really using the same process, which is to use the evidence to test the hypotheses. It seems to be true of all areas of human endeavour that if you want to know what's true, then test your hypotheses as rigorously as you can. So we've got this these control group, experimental group, quantitative things. Oh, this teaching method teaches students 2 grades better than conventional practice. We've got the qualitative stuff. Students need to think deeply about what they're learning. And we've also got a very small sector, which I'm really excited about, and we need much more, where you identify the most powerful teachers in terms of value added, and you go and video them and interview them and talk to the students and look at the students' work and find out why it is that this teacher is repeatedly in the top 1% of all teachers in their nation in terms of the value they add to their students. And if you use all of these 3 forms of evidence, quantitative, qualitative, and this sort of field work on the best teachers, the incredible thing is, if you look closely at it, there's a hell of a lot of overlap, and they're all saying pretty much the same thing. There are differences, but the differences are greatly outweighed by the commonality. And this commonality seems to me to express what learning is about, which is essentially the student making up their own version of what they've been taught and testing it. So you need them to express their understanding so we can examine it and improve it. And that's what the qualitative people will tell you. And the quantitative people will tell you, if you do that with mind maps, you get the most amazing improvement in students' learning. And so the student forms an understanding, forms it even more powerfully by creating the mind map, corrects it by looking at their other students' mind map, corrects it again by looking at the key points the teacher hoped would be on the mind map, and the student checking that it is. And so it sort of forces the student through the process. So I don't mean by constructivism the process of leaving the students alone. I mean by constructivism the very purposeful guiding of students, giving them information, but then requiring them by the teaching methodology you use. I don't mean in a vicious way. I mean in a clever way, requiring the student to form an understanding and then requiring them to improve it by feedback. Feedback, the student looking at other students' mind maps. Oh, I missed that bit out. Oh, they've expressed it slightly differently to me. Am I right or are they right? Peer explaining, peer discussion, that sort of thing. Gradually working out what the meanings really should be and really are. That process of constructing a meaning and improving it seems to me the most powerful. And I think actually there's barely anybody in teaching and learning that wouldn't accept that in the way I've described it. Although, unfortunately, as I say, the term constructivism has meant in the past something quite different. which is a very hands-off approach, which hasn't been found to work well at all.
Our academic staff, of course, would be really interested in the extent to which there is that commonality, and then to which you might need to discover thinking approaches that are very specific to a particular field. I suppose the question is, how far is it possible to draw together common approaches from across different discipline areas in terms of what works in teaching?
Yeah, there's a hell of a lot more in common than there is that's different.
Yeah.
For example, that thing about constructing meaning, that the learner constructs their own meaning and gets it wrong, and then we have to improve it by feedback. By feedback, by the way, I don't mean the teacher writing comments and giving grades on their work necessarily, although that's part of it, not the most powerful bit of it. I just mean the student discovering, oh, I thought this, but now I find that. Giving students information about whether their construct is correct is without the teacher even knowing or even doing it, is still feedback, and often the most powerful feedback. So a student looking at another student's mind map and saying, why have you got that there? Shouldn't you have said so-and-so? And the other student saying, no, I shouldn't, because he said such and such, didn't he? And then, a bit of dialogue going on and clarifying both students' points of view, feedback. There's an awful lot in common, going back to your question, between the different subjects, and an awful lot of methods can be adapted to work in any subject. I mean, you take, for example, the mind mapping thing. Most subjects could make use of that in some way. You could do it at PhD level. You can do it in a primary school. You can do it in English. You can do it in geography. You can, maybe some subjects like mathematics, you might be sort of find it less useful. But then there's some methods like self-assessment. There's methods like classroom discussion, which will work in absolutely any area. I've seen some fantastic class discussion in mathematics, for example. When I went to Romania, I saw a teacher who got a student to put a solution on the board for a very complicated problem. And the student sort of worked away on the chalkboard. And then the teacher stopped the student and said, okay, who thinks there's something that's not quite right about this solution? Which incidentally was fine. Who thinks there's something not quite right about this solution, or a bit they don't understand? Very open question. And a few students put their hands up and they said, why has he got a minus sign on that second line? I don't think that's right. And so the teachers, said, do you mean this one here? Yes, okay. And actually, the minus sign was just fine, But she said she was interested in the fact the students thought that was wrong, because she wanted to change their construct. She wanted them to think about that minus sign and work out whether it should be there and whether it shouldn't. And if it should be there, they need to understand why. So she didn't immediately say that's fine, as a lot of maths teachers would say, it's minus because of so-and-so. She wanted to know why they thought it should be a plus. So she said, okay, yes, there's a few of you I noticed a bit worried about this minus sign. Why do you think it should be a plus? Brilliant question, of course, because it should have been a minus. And the students would say, well, it should be a plus because of this, that, and the other. And she found what the misconception was that the class had got. It was most of the class, actually. She found the misconception. She dug down. She said, why do you think that then? And why do you think the other? And dug down until eventually she really understood the misconception. And then, almost magically, and it happens a lot, another student put their hand up and said, but it should be a minus sign, shouldn't it? Because da-da-da-da-da, and beautifully expressed the correct reasoning. And then you'd think at this point, the maths teacher would triumphantly say, you see, it should be a minus sign. No, she didn't. She turned to the ones who thought that it should be a plus sign and said, what do you think of that? And the students are thinking,
from what you've said, we've spoken about the applicability of methods across disciplines and the thinking skills that are very discipline specific, and you refer to that in your work as well. But what about the blended learning environment?
They have to form an understanding of it, express that understanding, and get the errors and omissions, which are inevitable, corrected. And so blended learning process is not different. in terms of process or in terms of methods. It's just a question of adapting the methods. What does the learning and the teaching is the activities that you set that make the students think in certain ways so that they form understandings, so that they get those understandings corrected. So it's how the technology is used. And I'm always a bit worried when I see people getting a bit too excited about the software and what the software will do, and not thinking about what's that doing in a student's head. And if you listen to all the people that are really expert on this area, it's fascinating how much they downplay the technology and how much they upplay the learning experience for the learner. What's going on in their heads is their question.